Welcome to 3D Modeling Software Part 1, using Tinkercad, presented by Central Texas Library System, Incorporated. This video lesson is part of the 3D Labs at Your Library grant funded by the U.S. Institute of Museum and Library Services through a grant to the Texas State Library and Archives Commission, 2017. This lesson provides an introduction to Tinkercad by walking through the creation of a bookend. A standardized model is used for each of these software introductions to help people focus on the use of the software rather than the design of the model. As you go through this tutorial, please remember that the goal is learning just enough to help the average person get started. Those library users who need technical mastery are expected to learn it for themselves. Just as library users should fill out their own job applications and write their own papers, they should also make their own models. As you watch this tutorial, the mouse clicks and keyboard commands will appear on the screen. The left mouse button will show as a red circle. The right mouse button will show as a blue circle, and the middle mouse button will show as a green circle. When a mouse button is held down, a second circle of the same color appears when the button is released. When the mouse wheel is pushed forward, a red arrow pointing up appears, and when the wheel is pulled back, a red arrow pointing down appears. Keystrokes that are commands, rather than typed into a field, will display in a white box toward the bottom and left of the screen. The actual location may vary slightly to make sure nothing important is obstructed. The mouse controls are becoming more or less standardized, but should be reviewed for each program. In Tinkercad, the left mouse button selects objects. The right mouse button rotates the view side to side and up and down. The mouse wheel zooms the view in and out, and the middle button pans the view side to side and up and down. When objects are created, they must be manually placed somewhere as the first step. There is one final note before starting the actual tutorial. The way that objects are positioned varies from program to program and should not be taken for granted. In Tinkercad, the build platform is the vertical center, but there is no horizontal center by default. As objects are repositioned, they are oriented relative to where they were just a moment ago. There is an optional ruler that may be placed on the build platform. The ruler establishes a horizontal center and simplifies explicit positioning. Before placing any objects, begin by adding a ruler. The ruler is in the upper right corner of the palette. Select it and place it on the center left of the build platform. The ruler may be repositioned by dragging the thick circle around. Clicking on the X will delete it. There is also a circle with 3 lines in it. Selecting this symbol alternates the ruler between measuring distance to the closest corner of an object and measuring to the center of an object. Hovering over the toggle causes words to appear that describe what selecting the toggle will switch to. To repeat the point, if the words "use midpoint" appear, then the ruler is currently measuring to the nearest corner, and clicking will change to use the center instead. Using the midpoint in all of the lessons in this series will add some consistency and help people focus more on the software and not so much on the calculations. For this reason, set the ruler to measure to the midpoints by clicking on the toggle so that the label reads "Use Endpoint." The ruler will now measure distances to the center or midpoint of objects. A bookend has 2 basic parts: a horizontal base and a vertical brace that holds up the books. We are starting with the back of the base. For this, we go to the Basic Shapes palette and select a box. When the box is highlighted, there are square handles at the edges and corners closest to the build platform, and a 9th handle on the face farthest from the build platform. There are also green and blue arrows along the side of the box. The box may be resized by dragging the handles or by typing over the numbers along the blue arrows. Click on the width number along the x-axis and type the number 50 to resize the box to 50 millimeters across. Now select the depth along the y-axis and make the box 120 millimeters deep. Now select the height along the z-axis and make the box 1 millimeter tall. The object may be positioned precisely by typing over the numbers along the green arrows. Because we are orienting from the center of a box that is 1 millimeter tall, it must be positioned 1/2 millimeter high. This will help ensure the model sits evenly on the platform when it prints. To do this, select the number along the green z-axis arrow and type 0.5. Also, set the x-axis arrow to 0 and the y-axis arrow to 0. This centering will help later on. Next is the front of the base, the part that slips under the books. For this, we begin by creating a cube. Resize the x-axis to 71 millimeters across. Resize the y-axis to 60 millimeters deep. And resize the z-axis to 1 millimeter tall. We then position it along the x-axis 60 millimeters to the right, along the y-axis to the center, and along the z-axis 1/2 millimeter high. There is a 1 millimeter overlap between the two boxes. If they merely touched each other, then they would print as two separate parts that easily break apart. The overlap tells the slicing software to combine them into a single part. The base is finished by creating a cylinder and resizing the x-axis to 60 millimeters, the y-axis to 60 millimeters, and the z-axis to 1 millimeter tall. This cylinder is now placed on the x-axis 95 millimeters to the right, on the y-axis at the center, and on the z-axis to 1/2 millimeter high. Add the vertical brace by creating a cube and resizing the x-axis to 5 millimeters wide, the y-axis to 120 millimeters deep, and the z-axis to 140 millimeters tall. It is then positioned on the x-axis 25 millimeters to the right, on the y-axis at the center, and on the z-axis to 70 millimeters high. This bookend is functional, but has room for improvement. Adding a hole to the brace will make the bookend stackable for better storage. This begins by making a cube and sizing the x-axis to 7 millimeters across, sizing the y-axis to 60 millimeters deep, and sizing the z-axis to 69 millimeters tall. It is then positioned on the x-axis 25 millimeters to the right, on the y-axis at the center, and on the z-axis 35 millimeters high. It sits right on top of the base, so the base will be flat with no bumps or depressions caused by the hole. Notice that the box to subtract is slightly wider than the brace. This addresses a side effect of how the model prints. Any surface where the hole and the part touch becomes a film with 0 thickness. Logically, this may seem like a non-thing, but the printer will attempt to make it. The result is a thin, partially formed sheet that covers the hole and interferes with the print. The effect can be artistic in the right circumstance, but creates a problem when an actual hole is desired. To create the hole, select the box, go to the color palette, and select Hole as the color. Treating the hole as a color is a particularly useful feature because it allows the hole to be easily modified later if that turns out to be needed. The hole in the brace is finished by adding a cylinder and sizing the x-axis to 60 millimeters, the y-axis to 60 millimeters, and the z-axis to 7 mm tall. The cylinder is placed along the x-axis 25 mm to the right, on the y-axis at the center, and on the z-axis 70 mm high. This cylinder also needs to be rotated 90 degrees along the y-axis. To do this, use the curved double arrows located above and to the sides of the object. Sometimes it is necessary to rotate the view to see the arrows clearly. Hovering over a curved double arrow causes a circle of lines to appear. Select the double arrow pointing side to side that creates a circle around the y-axis. The cylinder may be rotated freely by dragging the double arrow. Holding down the Shift key makes it snap to the 45 and 90 degree positions for convenience. The degree rotation may also be typed in by clicking on the number that appears. Once the cylinder is placed, it is then assigned whole as its color. Rounding the corners will give the bookend a nicer appearance and use less plastic. Starting with the base is slightly easier. The rounded corners will have the curve of a circle with a 20 mm diameter. To make sure there are no 0 mm films, we start with a box and size it on the x-axis to 30 mm wide, on the y-axis to 30 mm deep, and on the z-axis to 3 mm tall. We then make a cylinder and size the x-axis to 20 mm, the y-axis to 20 mm, and the z-axis to 5 mm tall. Now give the cylinder the whole color. Select both the box and the cylinder, and activate the Align tool on the right side of the toolbar. This causes a bounding box to appear around the selected objects, along with 3 rows of pins used to manage the alignment of the objects. Selecting each of the 3 middle pins will make sure the cylinder is centered inside the box. At this point, we need to trim the remaining object down to only one corner. To trim the object, add a whole-colored box and size its x-axis to 20 mm wide, its y-axis to 35 mm deep, and its z-axis to 5 mm tall. Now select Duplicate from the left side of the toolbar. The currently selected box is the duplicate. Use the rotation arrow at the base to rotate the box around the z-axis by 90 degrees. Select both of the whole color boxes and then activate the Align tool. Use the pins to align the boxes at the far right corners. Now select Group from the right side of the toolbar. By grouping the boxes, the center of the group is now used for positioning. Select the box that will be used to round the corner, the whole-colored cylinder, and the whole-colored corner piece that was just grouped together. Activate the Align tool, and use the 3 center pins to center all 3 pieces. Using Group on the 3 selected pieces creates an object which can now be assigned the whole color. To make a cornering hole for the other side, use Duplicate, and then activate the Flip tool on the right end of the toolbar. This makes 3 bold arrows appear around the object. Use the arrow that points along the y-axis to make the duplicate cornering hole work on the far corner. Select the cornering hole again to restore the positioning controls, and move it along the x-axis negative 22.5 mm to the left, along the y-axis 57.5 mm to the back, and along the z-axis 0.5 mm high. Select the original cornering hole and move it along the x-axis negative 22.5 mm to the left, along the y-axis negative 57.5 mm forward, and along the z-axis 0.5 mm high. Rounding the brace corners is next. This is essentially the same as for the base, except the curve will come from a 60 mm diameter circle to match the curve of the hole in the brace. Start by making a block and sizing its x-axis to 70 mm wide, its y-axis to 70 mm deep, and its z-axis to 7 mm tall. 70 mm is used because that is 10 mm more than the diameter of the circle, and definitely enough to prevent any 0 mm films. Next, make a hole-colored cylinder and size the x-axis to 60 mm, the y-axis to 60 mm, and the z-axis to 9 mm tall. To trim the object, add a hole-colored box and make the x-axis 40 mm wide, the y-axis 75 mm deep, and the z-axis 9 mm tall. Select Duplicate from the left side of the toolbar. The currently selected box is the duplicate. Use the rotation arrow at the base to rotate the box around the z-axis by 90 degrees. Select both of the whole boxes and then activate the Align tool. Use the corner pins to align the boxes at the far right corners. Now select Group from the right side of the toolbar. Select the box that will be used to round the corner, the hole-colored cylinder, and the hole-colored corner piece that was just grouped together. Use the Align tool to center all three pieces. Using Group on the three selected pieces creates an object which can now be assigned the hole color. Before creating the duplicate, rotate the object around the y-axis by 90 degrees. Now use Duplicate and then activate the Flip tool. Use the arrow that points along the y-axis to flip the new cornering hole so that it fits the far corner. Click on the currently selected piece and position it on the x-axis 25 mm to the right, on the y-axis 47.5 mm to the back, and on the z-axis 127.5 mm up. Position the other cornering piece on the x-axis 25 mm to the right, on the y-axis negative 47.5 mm forward, and on the z-axis 127.5 mm up. Books can be pretty heavy, and the leaning and rocking motions that come with library use will strain and eventually break the bookend where the base and brace connect. Buttressing the brace helps the bookend last longer. Start with the cylinder and size the x-axis to 20 mm across, the y-axis to 20 mm deep, and the z-axis to 80 mm tall. Place it on the x-axis 25 mm to the right, on the y-axis 45 mm back, and on the z-axis 40 mm high. Now add a sphere sized on the x-axis 20 mm, on the y-axis 20 mm, and on the z-axis 20 mm, and position it on the x-axis 25 mm to the right, on the y-axis 45 mm to the back, and on the z-axis 80 mm high. Select both parts of the buttress and duplicate them. Leaving the two new parts selected, position them on the x-axis 25 mm to the right, on the y-axis negative 45 mm to the front, and on the z-axis 45 mm high. The 45 mm height should be explained. The cylinder is 80 mm tall. Half of the 20 mm sphere rises above the cylinder, adding 10 mm, making the group a total of 90 mm tall. Since the group is being positioned from its center, the height is half the total, or 45 mm. indentations matching the buttresses let the bookends stack properly. Start with a cylinder and size the x-axis to 20 millimeters, the y-axis to 20 millimeters, and the z-axis to 82 millimeters tall. Position the cylinder on the x-axis 30 millimeters to the right, on the y-axis 45 millimeters back, and on the z-axis 40 millimeters high. Now add a sphere and size the x-axis to 20 millimeters, the y-axis to 20 millimeters, and the z-axis to 20 millimeters. Place the sphere on the x-axis 30 millimeters to the right, on the y-axis 45 millimeters to the back, and on the z-axis 80 millimeters high. Select both parts and duplicate them. Leaving the two new parts selected, position them on the x-axis 30 millimeters to the right, on the y-axis negative 45 millimeters to the front, and on the z-axis 44.5 millimeters high. Lastly, give both cylinders and both spheres the whole color. The final step is to save the bookend as a STL file, which is a standardized format for printing. Select Export from the right side of the toolbar. This opens the Download dialog. Select Everything in the Design as the option, and then STL to begin the download. Everything that was assigned the whole color will be automatically subtracted to allow correct printing. Thank you for listening to this lesson on Tinkercad. The sizes and placements of the objects used to make this bookend may be found in the script, which is also available. Lessons teaching other 3D modeling programs may be found on the CTLS channel.